You're listening to The Opioid Matrix, a journey into the rabbit hole, a Rigaku podcast, hosted by Michael Brown. This is an unfiltered conversation that examines how illicit narcotic trafficking is affecting every aspect of our society, including substance addiction, treatment programs, and law enforcement. Let's unpack the issue together.
Welcome to the Opioid Matrix. Today on the show, we have a guest that has been battling against the cartels as a special agent and leader at the Drug Enforcement Administration, Derek Maltz. Derek started his career with DEA in 1986 and has held senior positions as the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the New York Field Division and as the Special Agent in charge of DEA's Special Operation Division. Derek is now retired but still continues to fight against the cartels. Derek, first let me thank you for your service to the country and for taking the time to come on the show. Now, let's take a deep dive into the opioid crisis, right? Billions of fentanyl pills are seized at the U.S.-Mexican border. 1.4 million gotaways from Mexico have entered the homeland. Americans are being gunned down in Mexico, and 100,000 fentanyl-related overdose poisonings have occurred in this country. Derek, is America under attack by the Mexican cartels? And more importantly, what role is the Mexican government playing in this tragedy?
Michael, thanks for having me. I look forward to this discussion. Number one, the cartels are operating with impunity on our southern border. They actually are running the country of Mexico, as far as I'm concerned. They have infiltrated the highest levels of the government of Mexico. Just recently, the conviction of Genaro Garcia Luna in New York. He was the FBI director or equivalent in Mexico, but he was on the payroll of the Sinaloa cartel and other cartels making millions of dollars. So it's a very, very disturbing situation, especially now how the cartels have aligned themselves with the Chinese criminal networks who want to destroy and destabilize our country. So we have a very huge national security and public health crisis.
You know, that's an interesting point. You brought up the Chinese. You know, you and I are very aware of the Chinese connection in counter-narcotics trafficking for years based on our job performance. But, you know, American citizens don't understand, right? The precursor chemical supply chain. These are Mexican cartels involved in assisting the Chinese who are ordering the chemicals for us. And then missing the money laundering. You know, we never hear about what's happening with the money, Derek.
Right. So let me just go back a little bit just to understand the history. So the Mexican cartels have been benefiting from precursor chemicals coming out of China and other countries in Asia for many, many years. They've been producing mass amounts of methamphetamine, probably, I don't even know, 30, 40 years or longer. But you got to understand, in 2007, there was a very significant thing that happened which actually opened my eyes. The DEA, working with the Mexican counterparts, seized $207 million in cash in Mexico City, which actually came from a Chinese chemical broker. And at that time, as far as I know, it was all precursor chemicals to make methamphetamine. But it just is amazing the amount of money that was being generated from chemicals to produce synthetic drugs like methamphetamine. But then the Chinese started coming up with their own bombing of America in around 2008, directly through websites and chemical companies by sending synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic cathinones, K2 spice, bath salts. And America was getting hit. We didn't even know what was hitting us. As the head of the Special Operations Division, I had no idea what this stuff was. But I saw the impacts in the emergency rooms and the poison control centers. But then in 2012, about 10 years ago, we started seeing the shift to these fentanyl analogs coming directly from China into our country. And then, of course, it's changed even today. A lot of the business is being done, most of the business is being done out of Mexico. So it's this partnership. But now, because they have such good relations, they're using the Chinese for the money laundering services, which has been a game changer for this country.
You know, and how does that, remittance, mirror remittances, how does the money work? Let's say fentanyl comes into the U.S. from Sinaloa, local dealers sell it, the cartels collect billions of dollars in cash, and then what happens with that money?
So I'll just keep it real simple, Mike, because it's a great question. So, let's just say there's $500,000 in proceeds in Chicago. So the Mexican cartel leader in Mexico City works closely with the Chinese guy that's assigned to do the money laundering for this Chinese network. So they cut a deal. They decide that we got to pick up 500,000 in Chicago. So a young Chinese national in Chicago area is going to get a notification over an encrypted app like WeChat, for example. And we'll be told that there's a guy in Chicago who's going to drop off some contraband. Here's a serial number. Make sure it matches up, and then do the exchange. Once you get the money, let me know in Mexico, and I'll tell you what to do. So the young Chinese kid goes out, makes the local connection to the drug trafficker, gets the $500,000, and then contacts the person in Mexico, the Chinese national sitting in Mexico, who will then direct that courier where to bring the money. So in many examples, they'll drop it off to a Chinese businessman in America who has many different ways of laundering the money. So one of the common schemes, Mike, is that individual, once the Chinese businessman takes custody in America, they will then do an exchange through their Chinese banking accounts on their apps to move $500,000 from one account in China to somebody else's account in China. So let's, for example, say the cartels needed a new shipment of precursor chemicals. They would take the $500,000, send it to the precursor chemical company, order up $500,000 of chemicals, ship it to Mexico, and the business is growing. But let's say it was just to get the money back directly to the cartels. Maybe they'll order up, let's say, $500,000 in consumer goods, computers, toys, sneakers, clothing, and put a container together, ship it to Mexico. That would be resold for maybe $3 million, right? So now everyone makes money, the flea market owners, the economy in Mexico, but the cartel leader gets the $500,000 back that was dropped off in Chicago. But the bigger problem for America is that the Chinese guys now in America have that cash, so they're going out there buying land, they're buying property, they're investing in real estate, they're paying for kids' colleges. But as you know, there's a lot of intelligence now saying that Chinese nationals are spending over $6 billion a year to buy property and real estate, and sometimes next to our military bases. So I believe it's part of the Communist Party of China's campaign to collect intelligence, like the counterintelligence program right here in America. But they're doing it with drug proceeds now.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that the Chinese government or part of the CCP is working in conjunction with the cartels with a different agenda, right? That agenda is to subvert America, collect intelligence by using the cartel nexus as a gateway into the U.S.
Exactly. And also, I would go a step further and say it's part of their unrestricted warfare in China to destabilize and destroy their adversary. America is the greatest the greatest adversary to China. So we are a threat, and they want to destroy the threat. It's real basic. I was in a recent congressional meeting, and Mike McCall from Texas, the congressman, said it best. A great foreign policy for China is to sell fentanyl to America. That basically sums it up. They know that it's destabilizing, destroying our future generation. So who's going to be the future leaders? Who's going to be the military officers, the nurses, the doctors, the bus drivers, the teachers? They're going to be dead at this rate, 100,000 a year.
Well, we look at the increased flows in fentanyl. We look at what DEA is doing, state and local efforts, but then we look at new legislation. We look at decriminalization. We look at drug use injection sites. There seems to be a movement through harm reduction, and I get the idea, right? They want to save a life. They want to reduce overdoses. But in that rush to save a life, are we emboldening the cartels and the Chinese with this progressive legalization movement of narcotics?
Absolutely, Mike. And all you need to do is look at the experiment in Oregon. That place is a disaster zone. The crime is skyrocketing, the homeless is skyrocketing, the addiction is off the charts. You can't even walk down the streets anymore. And that was once a beautiful place. I was there in the old days, and I was impressed by that city. But the thing is that we should not be encouraging drug use at this point, because the drugs today are deadly. They're not this is not smoking a marijuana joint back in the 70s. Even the marijuana today, Mike, everyone wants to legalize marijuana, but what they fail to understand is that, first of all, the Chinese are playing a very, very robust role in the marijuana production and distribution in America right now. And the marijuana that's being put on the streets is very, very high THC content, maybe, 24, 25%. I don't know exactly, but there's recent studies all over the place showing that this high purity THC marijuana is causing depression, anxiety, psychosis, schizophrenia, and other mental illnesses, which is then causing kids to take these deadly pills because they think the pills are going to help them with their depression, their anxiety. So we have the perfect storm going on. The last thing any leader or politician should be talking about is legal use of these illegal, illicit, drugs that are so powerful and worse than we've ever seen in the history of the country.
New York, Boston, even DC, Colorado has an active decriminalization program. There seems to be a very progressive movement in some states to say, hey, you know what? We can't win the war on drugs, which is a term I don't like. But it seems to be a mentality of surrender. We can't get along. Let's go along and just let drugs be legal. And we'll just deal with that normalization.
Right. Well, there's nothing normal about 300 people a day dying in America. So something has to be done. But it's a very complex problem set because we left it unattended for many years. Like we let Big Pharma get away with dumping 100 billion opioids into America for a 9-year period because it was all about the money. It was protecting the big industry of Big Pharma. There was a lot of corruption in Washington. I lived this nightmare. I watched it. And they weren't allowing the DEA to prosecute these corporate leaders because of the money and the law firms involved. But Mike, when we were growing up as a DEA agent in the academy, one thing that was crystal clear, if you want to impact the drug networks, you have to take them out from the bottom to the top. So why then in the legal drug business, opioids being sold by Big Pharma, why then was DEA stopped at prosecuting the leadership in these corporations? That's the question for every American. And the answer is real simple, because money's power, and it's all about the money, not just for the illegal drug cartels, but the legal, I guess you say legal, the gray area cartels in America, which we call the American cartel. But it's really, really sad. And this evolution has caused monumental problems in America, and it's continuing to get worse. That's why I've been a proponent of increasing the aggressive actions in Mexico and putting more pressure on the Mexican government to step up and destroy the production labs in Mexico.
No, you talked about Purdue Pharma, the American cartels. I just recently read an article, I think it was CVS, just got hit with fines for over-distribution. They knew, they cashed in on this as well. I think Massachusetts just got a huge payout from several pharmacies who were over-prescribing Oxycontin, right? Which also contributed to this problem.
Right. And Mike, there's been so many fines, I can't even keep up with it, but that's part of the problem. The fines are not good enough because these corporations are making billions of dollars. So to pay, a fine of 60 million, 100 million, whatever it is, it's not really going to hurt them. You have to put some of their leaders in jail for being involved in a conspiracy to kill Americans with these opioids and not properly warning America about how addictive they were. So that's like a really sad story. We could talk all day about that. But unfortunately, it was the catalyst which has led to so many people that have died. And now with COVID and everything going on, it's just like out of control.
We look at, people often use this term, the war on drugs, as a failure. And I said, we'll explain that. And they said, well, the DEA hasn't been able to stop drugs coming in. They haven't been able to stop people from using drugs. I tell them, when I was an agent, I went to the academy. Our job wasn't to treat drug addiction. Our job was to go out, find the bad guys, and put them in jail, seize narcotics. And I think DEA, state and local law enforcement, have done a great job of doing that in America. But as I tell folks, DEA's authority stops at the U.S.-Mexican border. We can't go into Mexico.
But Mike, it goes even beyond that. And I can say this now because I hear it every day. So the DEA and the other federal agencies have done an outstanding job, as you said. And our Border Patrol, our CBP, and state and locals, they're warriors. They're fighting every day to save lives. But here's the problem. they make these cases all over America. They're identifying the subjects. They develop the evidence. They're seizing contraband and weapons and all that stuff. Then they can't get anyone to prosecute the cases because the United States Attorney's offices, they don't want to get involved with a drug case. There's a mentality that unless it's like, it's got a silver bow on it, they don't want to prosecute. So agents and everyone get frustrated. But it gets even worse than that. Then when they finally take down a U.S. network, they work tirelessly to develop the evidence on the kingpins in Mexico, as an example. Then they get the Department of Justice to do the job and get the provisional arrest warrants. And then they go and try to get these guys in Mexico. And right now, it's a horror show. The administrator of DEA testified, recently, and she basically called out the Mexican government that, they only got like 24 drug extraditions last year, but there's like 200 or more that are lined up, so they can't get the bad guys back in the U.S. to face justice. And that's the other part of the problem. It's very frustrating.
Well, it seems like we get them here, then we release them. I remember when I was in Afghanistan, I was part of the Haji Nourzai case. Haji Nourzai was released back into the custody of the Taliban. Now their drug production is increasing. General Cienfuegos was arrested for protecting cartels in the U.S., and he was released, sent back to Mexico. I believe currently the leader of the Gulf cartel is in jail waiting for extradition to come to the United States. So I'm wondering if that's even going to happen. So even when we target and we get these so-called top guys, we wind up releasing them. We're not getting them at all.
Right. So like Evidio Guzman is another scenario. They finally captured him this time, and he's supposed to be in custody, if that's true. Let's see if they extradite, Chapo's son. I don't think so, but I'd love to see the father and son together in prison for life in America. But
Right.
Mike, in my opinion, from watching this, and I do agree with recent statements made by the former Attorney General, that we can no longer treat the cartels as just a criminal organization because we don't have the support in Mexico and doesn't look like we're going to have that support anytime soon. So we have to step up the game, and whether we declare them terrorists or not is irrelevant. They need to be held accountable for the death and destruction of what they're causing to Americans. And I don't want to get in the middle of this beltway bureaucracy battle. Well, they're not terrorists because they don't have the ideology of a terrorist. Well, my simple response is, and I didn't go to MIT or Harvard Law School. I'm a very down-to-earth, straight shooter that sees things like just make common sense. They're killing more Americans than all of these terrorist organizations combined. And they're doing it with a deadly chemical substance from labs in Mexico and China. So they need to be treated more than just a criminal network or a transnational criminal. We need to destroy and decimate their command and control structure, and also, most importantly right now, the production labs in Mexico. That's the sense of urgency that we need right now.
No, 100%. And in terms of ideology, their ideology is money. Their ideology is power. So we get caught up on definitions. It seems like we change definitions all day long in America. Pronouns are now the big thing. So why not change the definition of what a cartel is? Because as you said, these cartels have transcended what a criminal organization used to be when you and I started back in the 80s. Right? These are now international, transnational criminal industries: human trafficking, organ trade, sex trafficking, murder, extortion. Drug trafficking just happens to be one unit, right, of a much more complicated criminal network.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it any better, Mike. And that's kind of the problem. I mean, in the Beltway, everything is antiquated and everything is old, right? It's kind of like our technology laws in America right now. I mean, it's still set up to do a rotary phone investigation. That's how archaic it is, right? We need to go after the providers that are pushing out technologies that law enforcement can't intercept. But yet the people that are sitting in Congress, they have cobwebs in their eyes and their ears, and you know what, on the backside, okay? They're not willing to understand the threats that are emerging every day out there in this world, and technology is a big part of it. Law enforcement is being left in the dust. So that's why we got to step up the game. We have to look at what they're actually doing. They're not just selling drugs. They're distributing poison that are killing Americans at record levels. Right. I always use the analogy like If we had 10 pounds of chemical, biological weapons sitting in Juarez, as an example, and the U.S. military knew that Al-Qaeda was moving that into America, do you think they would just sit back and do nothing? Or do you think they would take aggressive action to destroy that weapon of mass destruction? Well, fentanyl is the same thing, but Americans are not looking at it like that. They're looking at it as, it's just another drug issue. The war on drugs has failed, like you said. My response would be, if you want a war on drugs, let's get the latest and greatest technology that the U.S. government has, and we'll show them something that they've never seen in the history of their lives, and they will be accountable for the death of our kids.
Exactly. If you were to take a Al-Qaeda or Taliban strategy from the military in Afghanistan and simply remove the initials AQ or Taliban and put in Sinaloa or the top 5 cartels, you already have a plan, right? Cyber warfare, as you said, technology intercepts, figure out how things are moving, how the chemicals are coming in. How do we get those chemicals before they reach Mexico? I think there are a lot of mitigating efforts that could be utilized, but again, we don't want to disrupt trade, right? The international carriers who transport parcels, the maritime ships who move containers or precursors. There's a lot of players who are facilitating drug trafficking, in an unwitting sense, but nevertheless, the international corporations are being utilized to further narcotic trafficking.
Right. And one thing I want to make clear, Mike, because people try to spin this left and right. So we're not talking about going to war with Mexico. We're not talking about putting boots on the ground and start shooting up cities in Mexico. That's not what this is about. This is about using the latest and greatest technology and the experts in the U.S. to try to help the Mexican government to go after this threat like they never did before. However, if the Mexican government decides that this is too aggressive, this is not something that they want to do, then America has a tough decision to make. Do we rely on these corrupt, soft on crime Mexican leaders to dictate and to save, dictate policy and to save American lives? My response would be, we have to always look out for our kids and future generation, as a priority. So that would be a tough decision down the line, but at least initially, propose plans to Mexico. Like you said, we already have lessons learned on how to go after these type of, organizations. So it should be relatively easy. But right now, as far as I know, that's not even happening.
Well, I'm sure you heard President Obrador on TV recently last week talking about the drug problem is America's problem, right?
Yeah.
That there's no fentanyl being produced in Mexico. We heard the Chinese say the same thing. It's an American problem. You have drug users. Don't blame us. So I think it's obvious that we're not going to get help from China. It's more than obvious we're not going to get help from Mexico. So, if you were to go back into the special agent in charge of SOD, how would you advise the administrator? What kind of ideas would you implement to some kind of over-the-horizon strategy that could incorporate military and intelligence assets to go after this problem?
Okay, so let me just go back because I want to make sure this is crystal clear. Not only did he say they're not manufacturing fentanyl, I guess he's a little senile as well, because on February 14th, Mexico announced the seizure of one of the largest fentanyl labs ever, and AMLO made statements about how significant it was. And the Mexican army announced that it was more than 600,000 pills, and they had supposedly enough to 130 million dosage units with all the powder and everything that was in the location. So that's really even more disturbing, Mike, that he would say this now when he didn't even remember a month ago what he said to the world. So going back to your question, like if I was in charge, I would have been down there in Mexico a long time ago with not only myself, at least with Chris Wray, the FBI director, and hopefully Mayorkas. But then again, Mayorkas would probably be useless because he's also telling America that they have operational control over the border. And you heard what happened recently when the Border Patrol Chief Ortiz said, no, we don't have operational control. So basically, it's a lot of deception to the public. But I would go down to Mexico with a very, very short, focused plan to propose to the Mexican government what we want done immediately on the supply side. But I'd also have a comprehensive demand plan, like I called out recently in my testimony. I called out the current administration. I gave them a simple little task. How about having professional sports leagues and celebrities and role models, social media influencers in the White House for a forum and have a press conference that the president's going to declare a public safety, public health, national security emergency. And then ask these professional athletes and celebrities and role models to step up the game and start pushing out all over social media some really very focused 30-second, 45-second video reels on that this is something different. This is not a drug crisis. The drug supply is tainted. I mean, I did a very short video reel with Dr. Phil recently, which is out there on the internet, which basically shows me opening up 1 gram of sweet and low, putting it in my hand, saying that this could potentially kill 500 people if it was fentanyl. So we have to do innovative new things to get the messages out. No kid in America is watching mainstream media, and I shouldn't say no kid. The vast majority of kids are not watching mainstream media, cable news, listening to podcasts. They're watching the damn reels all day. So let's go, because I believe, Mike, in my heart, and I'm sure you would agree with me, that most Americans don't want to see these young kids as young as 12 and 13 years old dying. And now we have the infants dying because they're coming across the grandpas or the grandma or the babysitter stash, and they're dying at record levels too. So I think if the education was out there to these people, we can have a lot of effect on the kids immediately and spread the word, because right now it's failing miserably. We also need public service announcements. They got to spend money and put it on during primetime TV so parents can get the word. And right now, Mike, none of that is happening. But the biggest thing I will tell you that really pisses me off, and I haven't said this yet to anyone, but I want to answer the question because you know this, because you work in this business, you know this. As the head of SOD, I worked very hard for many years, almost 10 years, to bring a unified force of law enforcement patriots together. And it's not any one agency anymore. We cannot work that way. Everyone knows it, but leadership doesn't always act that way. We have to have the best and brightest from all these agencies at the table in a task force environment, to not just have a task force, but to have the results of the task force and to have everyone feel this unity of effort. Right now, we do not have that. And it's really, really sad for me to watch, because I know how powerful that can be. I saw the days of working together with the FBI and Homeland Security, U.S. Marshals, ATF, when we captured Chapo Guzman, because we had the CMAR in Mexico with our country team in Mexico working as this powerful force of good. The powerful force of good has to go against the evil. And right now, the powerful force of good is splintered. And I don't like that, because that's controllable. But that's what's happening, and that's really upsetting me, Mike. So we got to get back to that, and we have to have accountability on leadership across every agency, because we're no longer in a position, losing 300 Americans a day to this crisis, to just sit back and do things like we've always done it. And that's really, really pathetic.
You know, when I look at your background, I see the board with all the faces of people who took that wrong pill. You know, and we've talked to a couple of parents on this show, and they're like, Mike, you know, my kid wasn't a drug dealer. He never took drugs. He took an Adderall, turned out to be fentanyl. Who is going to be accountable, right, for that homicide? And I talk to a lot of harm reduction people, and they say no one's accountable. They say the system is accountable. They say the system is corrupt, and no one should go to jail, basically. And again, it's back to the legalization argument. So America seems to be split down the middle, right?
Yeah.
The victims of drug use, and then those who want to treat drug use as normalization, as a mental illness, so to speak.
Yeah, great points, Mike. I mean, we could talk, this could be an entire podcast, because like as mental illness is rising, depression, anxiety, the kids are like sponges. They watch things, they hear things, they hear the school shootings, they're paranoid, the families are fighting, divorces, financial issues. So the kids are feeling a lot of anxiety, and they turn to these pills, and they don't know what they're getting, and they die. But there's a lot of people that I work with, and the fingers are pointing all the time, Mike, and you're right. There's a lot of people that say, you know what? I don't really have sympathy. I don't want to see kids die, but the parents have failed. They haven't educated the kids. They're not there for the kids. They're divorced. They're single family, homes. So there's a lot of finger pointing right now. But my preference would be, let's not worry about what happened in the past. Let's fix it and move forward. We can fix it if we work together. Yeah, there's going to be resistance, but the end game should be saving the lives one way or another. We don't need to blame everybody, especially parents that are burying these 13-year-old kids and they're just devastated. So yeah, that's also making it more complex, honestly. And then there's like you said, the legalization movement is going on as well. But we have neglected drug education for many years. And I don't mean just don't smoke pot, it's bad for you. I mean, synthetic drugs have been a game changer, and it's something we've never seen. So people have to recognize that, and that's something that's lost in this argument.
I just read an article on natazines, right? There's been a number of overdoses related to a natazine called protonatazine. It's 3 times more powerful than fentanyl. You can go online and get it, right? We see xylazine, we see benzodiazepines. We see the rise of what I call the American PhD new gen chemist, right? These aren't the cartels. These are entrepreneurs in the U.S. who see an opportunity to understand synthetic opioids. And they're pulling these things off the shelf, and they're creating, you could say, competition with Mexican fentanyl, right? How do we fight against domestic drug traffickers, domestic synthetic new drug traffickers that are now getting in the game because they see the addictive qualities of these super synthetics?
Well, okay, there's another side of this I want to address, and that is it's another phase of China's unrestricted warfare, because as an example, right now, the illicit xylazine, the tranq that's eating people up from inside their bodies and causing amputations and skin ulcerations and all this stuff, that's being sold for $1 a kilogram on Chinese websites, just like the old days when they were selling fentanyl. And Chinese chemical people are creating this illicit xylazine. This isn't made in these pharmaceutical companies in America that I'm talking about. We're talking about, we don't even know what's in this stuff, Mike. And so this could be another phase of the Chinese attack, knowing that the Mexican cartels are doing a good job. But to address your point is, yes, we're seeing nitazines, isonitazines, etonitazines on the streets and also showing up in the autopsy reports. And a lot of people are trying to figure out, where is this coming from? Well, we know some of it's coming from China. We know that some of it's coming from Canada. We know that some of it's being made in American labs in people's houses. Just like we know right now, there are U.S. drug trafficking organizations, not Mexicans, that are buying either powdered fentanyl from Mexico or buying stuff on the internet, and then they're making their own fake pills in their basements. And they're buying the pill presses online on the internet. They're getting the dyes and all the binding ingredients and all this stuff. And they're making their own stuff. And why are they doing it? Not necessarily to kill kids, because they know that America has an obsession with the pills, and so they're trying to make money. So, I'll give you one quick story on this, because I think it tells the whole story. So last week or recently, Los Angeles DEA, working an undercover operation with Hawthorne police and others, they seized about 1 million fake pills. During that seizure, there was undercover negotiations prior where they were buying 10,000 pills. They were paying 75 cents a pill. Well, in Mexico, it's less than 15 cents. You pay 75 at a wholesale level, but then the pills will go for 10, 20, 30, 40, or even $140 a pill if you go on the Indian reservation in Montana. So the profit potential is so enormous, and it's so easy to make, apparently. Everyone's going to get in this game. So it's a runaway train, Mike. So it's becoming overwhelming as we sit back.
Remember when I worked in Detroit in the mid-'90s, I saw this was crack cocaine. I saw the average individual in the street go out and buy a couple ounces of cocaine and convert it to crack and make, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, it absolutely devastated Detroit. Which brings us back to, do we need to reschedule clandestine fentanyl as a Schedule 1 as opposed to a Schedule 2? Do we need enhanced guidelines? Do we need a federal statute instead of all the states looking at it differently? Do we need the federal government to step in and say, anybody who sells clandestinely made fentanyl, it's a Schedule 1. These are the minimum mandatory sentences when we start going after these dealers, right? These affiliate drug trafficking groups.
So, Mike, I was testifying recently, and this came up. because it's a no-brainer. Actually, I use the line that a third grader can understand that you must schedule these fentanyl-related substances as Schedule 1 now. There's no logic not to do it. The reason it's being held up is because there's a lot of people that are against these minimum mandatory sentences, which I also don't understand, because if you're selling poison in America and you're killing kids that don't even know what they're taking, not only is that deceptive and evil, but you need to pay the price. And so to me, that's a no-brainer. But that's not going to solve this problem. But it's certainly a positive step. And it also shows the commitment of our government to demonstrate how serious this is. And right now, that's half the battle. We're not really saying and doing what's necessary to make sure everyone in America knows how serious this is. So I tell you, one thing I just thought of, because it just happened. So in El Salvador, they have these now new prisons. I don't know how much you're aware of it, but I'm learning about them daily, where they're very proactive and they're putting these gangs in prison, and with the message that they're never coming back to the streets ever. And they're pushing them in there, and it's very, very high quality security, never going to escape, impossible to escape. And they're seeing the massive changes in the homicides. And I'm not talking about just one or two. And I don't know the exact stats, so I don't want to quote the stats. But at one point during the surge, they were seeing like 62 or 70, homicides a day. And now it's like down to almost nothing. So the president of El Salvador is proving to the country of El Salvador that there must be a deterrent. These people that are involved in this massive violence and this unbelievable, horrific stuff need to go and stay in jail and get them off the streets. And I'm very, supportive of that type of approach. And I don't mean putting some young, courier in jail for 30 years. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the violent, nasty people, and we're talking about the brains of the operations that know what they're doing. And every case would be separate, but that's a great example for the world to understand that putting people in jail for a long period of time is going to make a difference for the streets. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think the American perception, at least the criminal perception of prisons, is they're not afraid of it. Prisons have turned into gladiator colleges. The Aryan Brotherhood run a nationwide criminal organization from prison. Yeah. The Black Guerrilla family run a nationwide gang from prison. How have prisons become criminal hubs where they're allowed to segregate and develop their own sex? You can get narcotics, you can get sex. I think we need a prison reform, quite frankly, in our country.
We don't need sentencing reform. We need prison reform, because you're right. When they go to prison, they need to be held accountable, and they need to feel the pain, because otherwise it's just a joke. We're wasting taxpayers' dollars. So I would agree with many Americans that say putting people in prison is like a waste. Well, it's a waste if you don't hold them accountable in prison. Yes, right. I agree. And that's why they have to relook at that whole system. I'm not an expert on prison and prison reform and all that stuff, but I would say I like this, what I'm hearing and seeing in El Salvador. I spoke to folks recently on the ground in El Salvador that the public is really impressed by what they're seeing.
Well, I think the homicide rate, El Salvador was one of the most dangerous countries in the world, if I'm not
yes,
correct.
Exactly.
Incorrect.
And now it's like one of the best ever in any of these countries. Yeah.
But do we have to get to such a 9/11 event, Derek, before we actually decide to do something? I mean, we knew about terrorism and Al-Qaeda for 10 years. We watched them blow up our embassies. We watched them kill Americans. And we tried to deal with it as a criminal prosecution problem. 9/11 happened, and we said, okay, we've got to change the way we look at terrorism and go after Al-Qaeda. And we got to go to where the center of gravity is.
Mike, you know what? You couldn't have said it better, because that's my frustration. When I retired, fortunately, I spent the last 10 years in the hub of operations, synchronizing these cases worldwide. So I was privy to a lot of intelligence and emerging trends. And actually, my last week on the job, and I think I might have sent it to you, I sent a visual out to motivate people that the gap is growing between good and evil, and we have to do everything in our power to close that gap. Unfortunately, it's really taken off, and we're losing a handle on these bad guys. They're more sophisticated. They're more global. The internet's changed the game. Synthetic drugs have changed the game, but the political views have also changed the game. And unfortunately, I've been preaching, at least for a solid 5 years now, how the cartels are not just criminal networks, how they're killing, how the Chinese are involved. Nobody was listening for the first few years. Now, all of a sudden, because the families are out there and they're demonstrating to the local politicians and the media how much this is devastating their families, communities, and has killed their kids. Now, all of a sudden, the politicians want to make like that this is important to them. And that's kind of disgusting, too. I mean, I hate that part of it because every American should care about the death of our kids.
You know, we just had, I think, 3 American citizens, 3 women were kidnapped and disappeared in Mexico recently. We had the 2 Americans gunned down, the other 2 kidnapped and tortured. We had the 9 Mormons, 6 of which were women and children, gunned down and burned in their cars. We had the ICE agent who was gunned down and killed. His partner was shot. And of course, we had our own agent, Kiki Camarena, and I think it was 86, who was kidnapped and murdered by the cartels. There seems to be a long established list that Mexico is not our friend. What's it going to take for the American government to wake up and say, you know what? All these homicides and murders and aggression and fentanyl, it's time to stop. I don't care about trade. I don't care about the deficit. We need to do something now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that one because right now we have very soft on crime leader in Mexico and we have a very soft on crime leader in America. That's the perfect storm on devastation for the country. It's that simple. And I mean, you saw, the guy is proud. Now, I kind of edited it a little bit. It's hugs, no bullets. I call it hugs for thugs, no bullets. Okay. But in the United States, we're letting fentanyl dealers out on the streets because of antiquated bail and, the bail reform that's going on. Like in New York, I remember, and Bridget Brennan's one of my friends, the SNC prosecutor up there, Special Narcotics Court, and they had to let these guys out on I think it was 20,000 fentanyl pills because it didn't meet the criteria to hold them. And then it was I think 150 pounds of meth also, had to let them go. I know in California, they had a couple of guys, Mexicans, that they let go. So this is all the stuff that has to be updated. And unfortunately, we don't have the leadership that's putting those messages. That's why, Joe Biden today can go out and hold a meeting and declare to the world that we have a national security and a public health and security crisis in America. He's going to hold a press conference once he gets the sports teams and start just ramping it up. But that's not happening. They're not even saying the word Bailey fentanyl. They're confusing the public on old, antiquated talking points on the opioid crisis.
Well, you talk about influencers, and I look at the African-American community, I look at rap music, I look at trap music, I look at this very violent gangster music that's generating billions of dollars that advertise Mercedes-Benz, Richard Mille, $100,000 watches. There seems to be a music industry culture that supports violence, that supports drug trafficking, that supports homicides in the inner city because it makes money. And who's going to go against that?
Well, that's the same problem we're having in the professional sports league. I'll tell you a quick story, which is kind of interesting. I was in a mobile studio to do a show the other day, and I'm getting my Twitter direct messages from Enes Kanter, now known as Enes Freedom, the basketball player who spoke out against the NBA and the relationship with China with all the human rights violations. And now Enes Freedom is this national hero to many people. But he's also antagonizing these multi-millionaire basketball players. And he sent me a message and said, Mr. Maltz, your testimony was right on point. We need these athletes to step up. This stuff going on in China is out of control. How can I help you? Well, long story short, we exchanged messages, text messages, emails. He put out, immediately messages on his Instagram and his Twitter site. And he's got, a few million, I can't remember how many followers. So at least this guy is trying to do the right thing. But I believe in my heart that if some of these professional athletes understood this is way different, this is not smoking marijuana, that they would step up. There was another guy we recruited, a lineman for the Philadelphia Eagles, Jack Driscoll. Jack lost his buddy, Joe Dean, up in Connecticut many years ago to fentanyl poisoning. Well, Jack's now a big NFL player. So he had the opportunity to highlight the nonprofit that Joe Dean's family made, Demand Zero, on his cleats, his Nike cleats. They call it like Cause for Cleats, right? And he did this commercial. Well, he wanted to go on news and start talking more about this. He wasn't allowed. Now, I don't know if it was his agent or the NFL or somebody else, but he wanted to do it. He wanted to talk about this crisis. Now, Jack doesn't have multi-millions of followers. You know, he's not like Tom Brady or J.J. Watt or LeBron James or the big name folks. But they don't want to come out and speak about it because it's very controversial. The drug stigma. This is poisoning America. This is not about just smoking pot. They don't want to be that guy in the NBA or NFL that speaks out against drugs. You wouldn't be speaking out about drugs. You'd be speaking out about poisoning our kids. How many of you out there wouldn't want to save lives? So I've been trying hard on this, Mike, and I have not been successful. And I appreciate Ennis Frida reaching out to me, so we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, but this reminds me of how difficult it was, or how NFL teams caved when players wanted to take a knee during the national anthem.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
There was this whole movement to support this anti-American movement, in my opinion, to support taking the knee. So this all comes down to money and influence, it seems like.
Yes, 100%. Like we always have said, Mike, and we know the saying, you got to follow the money, right? It's all about the money, not only with the bad guys, but the good guys as well. Quote unquote good guys. I don't mean that literally good guys, but you know what I'm saying.
It seems to be the underlying motivation from Purdue Pharma to the vehicle industry, the auto industry, who have companies in Mexico who don't want to see a trade war, who don't want to see a drug war in Mexico, because it interferes with billions of dollars in corporate profit. And again, the relationship with China, manufacturing, trade. We see this government not taking a very strong stance against a country who obviously does not have our best intentions at hand.
Hey, Mike, let me just say this because I can kind of sum up something because it really bothers me. So I don't know the current drug czar Gupta. I never met him. But from what I've seen and what I've heard him say, he seems very caring and passionate about the drug crisis. So recently he was testifying, and I watched it over and over again. And he talked about how this is the worst drug crisis we've ever seen, that it was unacceptable to him and the president. He said it's a direct threat to public health and national security, and that it's a new era of drug trafficking, okay? And he also said, like, addiction is a disease and it must be treated, okay? And he's urging the PRC to join them and everything like that. And he even acknowledged that they've chosen not to engage, and there's no excuse for inaction. But here's my question to the drug czar and to the president. Based on all these statements that you're making, you've acknowledged what a disaster this is for America. So my question is, where's the new era of attacking this problem at a level we've never done before? Why are we continuing to do the same old thing and watching these kids drop? And I don't understand. I can't answer that, Mike. I wish I could answer that. It's a very complex and very convoluted situation. It seems pretty basic. I mean, the president last December, not 22, I think it was 21, he made statements exactly saying that the drug crisis is an unusual and extraordinary threat to public safety and national security. So then the obvious question would be, all right, Mr. President, then why is that border wide open, facilitating their ability to get their command and the command and control leaders into America and also their product? Like, why is this happening? If you believe this, if you say this and you believe it, doesn't make sense, doesn't add up.
Yeah, you have to take into consideration, too, that the cartels are in control of the border. There was that recent, with I think it was the cartels, the immigrants, they rushed the border. I think it was in Brownsville.
El Paso,
El Paso, thank you. They rushed the border because they got an email on their Facebook saying the border was open.
Yeah.
So now the cartels are using cyber warfare against us so they can push more fentanyl in while CBP is trying to maintain a mob.
Exactly. And then just like they use drone technology, okay, like militaries, where they're surveilling our border patrol with their, thousands of drones that are entering our airspace, and they're getting away with it. And by the way, what scares the hell out of me is that they put videos out now dropping C4 explosives on these same drones. So if they start doing that on the border. Can you imagine that? And I was down there and they told me, Mr. Maltz, we're not allowed to shoot those drones out of the sky. That's like an FAA like directive or whatever. Like what?
Right.
Anyway.
Well, the hands are completely tied. But as you said, these are not the drug cartels, or these are not the drug groups that we investigated back in the 80s and in the 90s. Yeah. This is a new era of drug trafficking.
So I said during the testimony, Mike, I said, this is not grandpa's opioid crisis, okay?
Right.
And the other thing I want to add, because you asked a good question and I didn't answer it, is that the other thing that I raised to the attention of Congress is that the current Attorney General, although I never met him, I don't know him, I'm not taking any position on him, but his group, or maybe it was signed by him, recently sent out a memo to all the United States attorneys in America in December. He sent it out, putting more restrictions and more requirements to get them when they charge like minimum mandatory or they recommend minimum mandatory. And like the DEA and other agents out there, they're really upset about this because this is not the time to be putting more bureaucratic requirements on agents that are out there trying to save American lives. So that's also what's going on that people don't understand. That's contributing to the problem.
Well, as a former special agent in charge, the paperwork is already enormous on our agents. And the last thing we want to do is make that process more complicated. But Derek, we're just about out of time. I want to give you the last word, maybe talk about some of the events you have coming up or some of the public messaging you will be doing.
Well, I want to start off by saying to anybody that's listening, and this is just my opinion, go watch Dead on Arrival. It's 20 minutes. Watch it with your kids, your grandkids, your nephews, your nieces. It's worth the time because it's going to educate you on very important, very real examples of how deadly this fentanyl is, and you must talk to your kids. Every kid is vulnerable. Number two, there are plenty of resources out there. DEA's onepillcankill.gov, Song for Charlie, Lost Voices of Fentanyl, Voices for Awareness, Demand Zero. Like I could go on all day. But there's resources to educate you and your family on how to do better and how to save your kids' lives. Because if you're going to rely on corrupt and soft on crime leaders in Mexico or the current administration, what they've shown us, it's going to be too late. You can't educate or treat somebody in the morgue. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to continue full speed ahead, doing as much media, as much congressional outreach, as much interaction with my family groups around America to support them, to spread awareness, and to save lives. I can't go out and go after bad guys anymore. That's not my job. But I will hopefully be able to influence people out there that they can all work together and save lives. We need a synchronization of effort all across America, not just law enforcement, to deal with this crisis. And it's not going to go away. So if we sit back, it's just going to get worse. So that's my spiel on that, Mike.
Well, Derek, I want to thank you for coming on the show. You're definitely an inspiration to fellow agents like myself who have retired and trying to reinvent ourselves so we can still we're still relevant in this fight against narcotics and drug trafficking. But I want to thank you again for coming on the show. We definitely have to have you back in a few months to see how this drug situation is going so we can continue to keep people updated with the most relevant information. So again, I want to thank Derek Maltz, former special agent in charge of the DEA Special Operations Division, for coming on to the Opioid Matrix. Derek, thank you.
Rigaku Analytical Devices is a U.S.-based manufacturer of advanced analytical equipment for the identification of unknown substances. Utilizing Raman in our devices means we can non-destructively scan through packaging with a result of identification in less than 1 minute. Rigaku is committed to supporting and partnering with your agency to tackle this problem together. To learn more, visit rigakuanalytical.com. Thank you for joining host Michael Brown for this episode of the Opioid Matrix, a journey into the rabbit hole, a Rigaku podcast. Keep connected with us by subscribing to the show on your favorite podcast player. If you like what you've heard, please rate the show. No matter the controversy around the illegal drug supply chain, our mission is to save lives. Thanks for listening. Until next time.